Hello folks. Today I'm going to be doing a review of this Amico TIG 225 welder. This is one of many cheap welders that show up all over Amazon and eBay. Many of them are very similar, even among different brands, and a lot of them appear to use the same basic design with different cases and slightly different features. There's some debate over how good this type of welder is. They certainly are inexpensive for the features and specs they have, and they seem to have some good reviews out there. So, do they offer good performance for a killer price, or are they just too good to be true? The specs on this one do seem optimistic. It lists a 60% duty cycle at a max output of 220 amps. I wanted to find out if these welders were any good, and I figured the best way was to get one and try it myself. I admit I have preconceived notions about these types of welders, but I don't like to assume, and people are always looking for a less expensive option, particularly when it comes to TIG welding, which can be pretty expensive. So I wanted to show what you can get out of one of these welders without question of motives or biases. I bought the welder with my own money. I will be as objective and fair as possible, and I will give my honest opinion. I will show the real numbers from any output testing. I'm not affiliated with any brands. And while I do have some preconceived expectations, I don't want the welder to do poorly. I hope it does great, and I will share the honest results and opinions one way or another, because I don't want anyone to be misled. I only say all of this because there are some glowing reviews of this welder on Amazon and even a couple on YouTube. But from the very little I've looked over the welder so far, I have a strong feeling my review will not end up positive. So I wanted to be sure everybody knows where I'm coming from before somebody cries foul. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. First I'll go over the included components, features, and impressions of the welder itself. And after that I had planned to jump right into some arc shots and performance testing. But just in setting up for the video, I already found a couple of issues that I want to address before use. So I guess a look inside the case is going to come before any welding. This video may end up being split into multiple parts. I'll have to see how things go. One quick note, not to be nitpicky or anything, but when I opened the box, and actually it's been sitting out here for a couple of days, and even still, there's a very strong chemical smell to all of this, to the welder and all the accessories. It is dissipating a little bit after it's been sitting out here in the garage for a couple of days, but even still, just standing here I can smell it. So just something to be aware of. It does have that kind of real funky chemical smell to basically everything that was in the package. So first things first, in the box was the manual, and inside the bag with the manual is a single thoriated tungsten. It is pre-ground. It's not the best grind in the world, but it is ground. But one thing that is just a little bit annoying is that it comes with this extra card in addition to the manual, just basically begging you to go online and give them good reviews. So that's kind of tacky, but either way, it is what it is. It does come with a gas hose for the argon. It has your pretty standard fittings for going into the regulator on the one end and the welder on the other end. However, that does lead us to our first major issue with this setup, is that the fitting on the back of the welder does not work with the included hose. And I'll talk about that more when we start looking at the welder itself. But as far as the gas hose itself, it is a little bit cheap looking and feeling. The crimps are kind of rough. The fittings are a little rough. They're kind of crooked and stuff. Nothing too majorly wrong with it, but, not great, but not too bad. The included adapter to plug the welder into 120. This is a dual voltage machine. It can plug into 240 or 120 volt outlets. And this is the included adapter to plug into 120. And nothing wrong with it. It's just your pretty standard, typical pigtail. It does come with an electrode holder for stick welding. The cable's fine. It is about a number 4, about a 4 gauge wire. DINS connector on the end to connect to the welder. The stinger or actual electrode holder itself is pretty cheap. The spring on it is fairly stiff, but the jaw is kind of loose and can wobble around a lot. And the plastic on it is just really cheap feeling plastic. It's to be expected. It would probably work okay, but it's certainly nothing to write home about. The ground clamp, or work clamp I guess in this case, a little bit nicer, honestly. Still number 4, 4 gauge cable. Feels pretty stiff spring. It does have a copper strap in there and copper jaws, so not too bad. Seems like that should work fine. Now the TIG torch comes in this little bag, and there's some accessories in here. So I'll go ahead and pull this out and give you a look at it. So the torch does come with a few different size back caps, a few different size nozzles, and 3 different size collets for the collet body, so you can run what looks like probably 1/16, 3/32, or 1/8 inch electrodes. And honestly, these should work, but one thing I do notice is that the collets themselves are pretty poor quality. The holes aren't centered very well. There's just really rough spots. The taper on the end for clamping it down isn't even. It's not the same all the way around. So honestly, these aren't great. But the nice thing is they're consumables anyway. You can get these a lot of places, and they're not all that expensive to get replacements. But the included ones probably work, but they're pretty rough. All right, so let's take a look at the TIG torch itself. It is a 26 style torch, so it's a fairly large torch to begin with. It's a 200 amp rated, or at least the 26 style is typically a 200 amp rated air-cooled torch. But as is common with a lot of these welders, it does have a little bit of extra bulk in the handle. This one also has this kind of a ball joint on the end to make this more flexible here. So that adds a little bit of size. And with the button and the valve, it just makes for a bulky torch. And for comparison, just so you can kind of get an idea, this is a CK26 torch. So this is again 26 style, 200 amp rated torch. And just to give you an idea of the size difference, just so you can get a feel for just how bulky this torch is. You can see it's noticeably longer even without this ball joint here on the end. Quite a bit thicker, just bulkier overall. So just to give you an idea what you're getting with this torch. The built-in button will control the welding current on and off. It kind of has molded in almost like a little up and down arrow. I think that's probably just because they use this same rubber cover over the button on ones that actually have a rocker to turn the amperage up and down. This one's just a button on and off. This welder does not actually have any provisions for remote amperage control. So that means you have on-off, but you have no control while you're welding. You don't have the ability to add a foot pedal or remote amperage control in the torch or anything like that to be able to control the amperage while welding. So that does limit the welder a little bit for what you can do. Not that you can't do a lot without remote amperage control, but some things you might want to do, real precision things, stuff like that. It's really nice to be able to, on the fly, turn that amperage up and down as needed. So just be aware that while this welder does have a high frequency start and a control button on this torch, there's no way to add amperage control later. And this is just the connector that plugs into the front of the welder for the switch here. The hose itself, fairly stiff rubber hose, nothing too surprising there. It does have this kind of a vinyl rubber sheath on it, and really I think it's just to kind of keep everything neat and together. It's not leather or anything like that. It's just kind of a plasticky rubber. So nothing wrong with it, but there it is. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about this setup, this is just kind of the standard fitting that is on the end of a 26 style torch cable. And this fitting allows the gas to pass through, but also the current. So the welding current will pass through this fitting. And usually on TIG welders, you're going to have some kind of adapter that this fitting threads into. And then that adapter plugs into the power outlet on the welder. And then that power outlet would either be a gas through fitting, or there would be a separate gas hose that comes off of that adapter and threads into the gas outlet on the welder if the welder had a separate gas outlet. Now in this welder, it's a little bit different. There is a separate gas outlet on the front of the welder, but they actually just jumper the welding current over to that gas outlet, and then they just thread this fitting directly into the gas outlet, and it gets its current straight from there. So this fitting actually has to be threaded into the gas outlet on the welder in order to get the gas and to get the welding current. Just a little bit of a different setup. And just to show you what I'm talking about, this is an adapter that's pretty common on a lot of welders. So inside here under this cover, the fitting like this on the end of the cable actually threads into the back of this adapter. And then there's a separate gas hose for gas inlet into the torch cable. and then this would connect right into the DINS connector on the welder for the welding current supply. So this is a pretty common setup if the welder has a separate gas outlet, which this one does. But on this one, they instead just went with screwing this fitting directly into the gas outlet and having the welding current come through the gas outlet. So as the package comes, there's really no way to even use this gas valve that's on the torch because you don't have a separate gas outlet coming out of the fitting that could be connected directly to a regulator or something like that. The torch cable just threads directly into the gas outlet on the welder. This has to be connected right to the welder the way it comes, and so there would be no way to bypass the internal solenoid and just use this valve if you wanted to, unless you were to buy one of those adapters. And they are available a lot of places online. Since it does have a standard DINS connector, you could just get that adapter and use it that way if you wanted to. But as it comes, to use this torch, this has to be threaded straight into the gas outlet on the welder. So that's the torch. Should be usable, just a little bit quirky with the valve and this weird ball joint and the way it connects. So a little bit odd, definitely very bulky. So it'd be a little awkward to use, especially on kind of small, tight spaces, but should work. So that's pretty much it for the included accessories. Quality is pretty poor on some of the things, though it does all seem like it should at least work. And with this type of accessory, the consumables, that kind of thing, it's all replaceable, it's all available, lots of places, local welding shops, online, all that kind of thing. So if you did ever have issues with any of it down the road, you could replace or upgrade as needed. So it's not a huge deal that some of that is lower quality. For the price of this, you would pretty much expect the accessories to be low-end stuff. And like I said, it does all seem like it should be functional. All right, so now let's take a look at the welder itself. The front panel here is pretty simple. It's all pretty self-explanatory. You have an amperage gauge here, which shows you what the set amperage is. I don't know yet if it will show what the welding output is during welding. I haven't actually powered it up and started using it yet. You do have a little power available or power on light and an over temp light here. Just a basic rocker switch here to switch between TIG and stick modes, and an amperage dial. And this is smooth, infinitely variable knob. No real issues here, nothing jumps out at me. One thing I do note is that this sticker is kind of popping off, but that's no big deal. Now down here at the connections, again, pretty simple. You have your negative and your positive DINS connection outputs. You have your control connector here, and this is the gas outlet, but it is also the TIG Torch amperage outlet. This is where the TIG Torch is going to get its welding voltage and amperage. And really the main reason that is of note in terms of the welder itself is just the fact that this is sticking out pretty far. It's not shielded or covered or anything, so while you're welding, this will be live. Just something to keep in mind, you wouldn't want to bump that on anything or ground that out while you're welding, because this would be hot. Side of the welder, nothing too exciting there. You just have some vent louvers, Amico power label, and that's pretty much it. Nothing too exciting there. And now we have the back of the welder, and this is where things start to get interesting and actually problematic. On-off rocker switch, nothing too exciting there. You have your cooling fan here. I measured it. It's only about an 80 millimeter cooling fan, so that's actually pretty small. Computer power supplies have a fan about that size, so it doesn't necessarily mean anything, but just comes back to that whole 60% duty cycle at 220 amps being kind of questionable. First issue I noticed on the back is that this fitting for the power supply coming in is actually loose. It's just it can just totally flop around there. I don't know what kind of stress is being put on those cords inside, or if from this rotating, if it's pulled anything loose or anything kind of messed up there. So that's the main reason I want to pull the case open. Make sure the power connections aren't messed up, make sure everything's connected, everything's solid and secure before I go plugging this thing in. The next issue, hopefully you can see that, is the gas input fitting. That is not a typical fitting. That does not work with the included gas hose. Even with the included gas hose threaded all the way in and tight, it can still flop around loose in there. It leaks terrible. There's no way to use the included gas hose with that fitting. But also, it's not a normal tapered pipe fitting either, so a no pipe thread fitting will fit in there. and nothing I could find easily or locally will actually work with that. So I did pick up a couple things at the hardware store I'm going to try to make work, but the included fitting is basically unusable in terms of argon input. And that's a fairly big problem because since the TIG Torch actually uses the gas fitting for its welding current supply, there's no way to hook this directly up to a regulator and then just use the gas valve that's actually on the torch to control the gas flow, because it actually uses this fitting for the amperage supply. So this actually has to be connected to the front of the welder in order to use the included torch. And so you have to be able to use this fitting in order to use the welder or the torch as it comes. So hopefully I came up with something just to kind of rig this temporarily just so I can use it and test the welder out. So hopefully that works okay. If not, I'll probably actually have to remove this fitting from the welder completely and put something else on there. So that's kind of a big deal. The welder as it comes cannot actually be used for TIG welding just because it doesn't have the correct fitting here. Now the power cord itself seems okay. The insulation material is a bit stiff, probably a little bit cheap, but it is a 12 gauge power cord, so not too bad there. Power cord should be fine as long as I can get this tightened up inside. And the data tag is actually on the underside of the welder, so for anybody who wanted to see that. And here you can see that with 240 volt supply, it is showing 60% duty cycle at 220 amps in TIG mode and 60% duty cycle at 200 amps in stick mode. And is actually showing 100% duty cycle all the way up at 170 amps. So if there's any truth to that at all, that's some pretty good duty cycle. Now on 120 volt supply, it's showing 150 amp max output, and it's showing a 60% duty cycle at that. But keep in mind it's saying that at that 150 amp output, it's going to be drawing 42 amps from the wall. Now you would never get a 60% duty cycle at a 42 amp draw just because of the outlet. You'd trip a breaker or you'd damage wires or the outlet, the receptacle itself or something like that, because that's just not likely to happen. So keep in mind, if this draw is accurate at this output, you probably won't really ever get that kind of output on 120 volts. So there's the look at the welder itself. Overall, as expected, the plastic feels kind of cheap. The overall build quality actually isn't too bad, but there is kind of a general feel of cheapness to it, which is kind of what you'd expect. So as long as the performance is good, kind of that general feeling of cheapness wouldn't really bother me. It is very small and very light. One spec that definitely is correct is the weight. Online it says the weight is 16 pounds, and that is almost exactly what it weighs. Kind of awkward to lift it there around the camera, but 16 pounds 2 ounces is what I get on this scale. So if there's any truth to 60% duty cycle at 220 amps output in a welder this small that only weighs 16 pounds, I would say they have quite a lot to teach some of the other welder makers. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this apart so that I can check out that power cord. While it's open, we might as well take a look inside and see what's going on in there. Alright, so I opened the welder up and the power cord was a simple fix. I was able to just tighten up this nut and it's actually tight in there now, so no more flopping around. I did check all the connections, the spade terminals and everything. Nothing's twisted up, nothing's pulled loose, so that should be all good to go. And while it's apart, we might as well take a quick overall look at the inside of the welder. You can see pretty simple design, not a whole lot to it. We have the main power board down here where the main AC power comes in. It gets rectified by the two SCR modules bolted to the heatsink there. Gets sent up to the control board here, to kind of the inverter board up here, and from there it's sent up to the power transformer, and then to the main power IGBTs where it's sent out as welding output. And down here you can see the spark gap for the high frequency start feature this welder has. And with it opened up, you can really just get a feel for just how tiny this welder is. I mean, you can see it's just, just in that much space is everything there. So very small. Doesn't seem to be put together too bad. Does have some kind of an epoxy on a lot of the screw terminals and also the plug-in connectors, just to keep those from rattling loose. As you would expect, it's got kind of generic Chinese capacitors throughout and stuff like that, but not too bad. Really, the main thing I come back to is just once again questioning the output and duty cycle for something this small with just this small amount of heat sinking. And also, once the high current output comes out of the transformer, it actually just goes through traces on this board. And you can see they just added extra solder to the traces to increase their current handling capacity. So it'll be interesting to do some testing on this, see if we can actually get the full 220 amps out of it, and see if we can get anywhere close to the duty cycle they claim. Just a couple more quick notes on some things I would like to see done a little bit better on these power caps here. Would have been nice to see some kind of epoxy or silicone or something kind of between these, just to keep these from being able to wobble like that. Maybe not a huge deal, but one of the nice things about this welder is the fact that it's just so small and so light. So if it did work well, it'd be nice to be able to just, have this behind the seat of the truck, or throw it in the back of the car or something when you want to take it somewhere to do some repairs. And if you're taking this with you a lot, it's traveling a lot in a vehicle or something, it would have been nice to see a little bit more vibration protection on that. Another thing that's probably not a huge issue, but it's just a little funky. This circuit board with the transformer on it, you can see it's actually kind of sloping down. It's kind of tweaked, kind of bent downward, and there's really nothing supporting this corner of this circuit board. So this can actually just kind of wobble a little bit too. It doesn't move all that easily, but again, it would have just been nice to see this board supported a little bit better. So that's just a quick look at the inside of the welder. Let me get the case back on it, and we'll go from there. All right, welder's all back together. I actually left the garage to get a drink. As soon as I walked back in, I was hit with that odd chemical smell that this welder has. So it's officially filled the whole garage with its smell. But anyway, that's the overall first impressions. Nothing really too surprising. The main issue is just the gas fitting on the back. If it was just a different fitting than what was on here, and I had to, cut this and use a hose clamp, something like that, that would be one thing. Or if I just had to get an adapter, it would be annoying, but it wouldn't be a major problem. But just the fact that it's really a completely unusable fitting is a problem. It's not a pipe thread fitting. It doesn't have a tapered seat. It's literally just a threaded hole. So, that alone might be a deal breaker for some people. Other than that, nothing too major. Fairly low quality accessories, kind of to be expected. Some odd quirks and things. But I'm going to wait to make the final judgment until we actually fire it up and get some use on the welder and see if it actually can do what it says it can do. But with that, I think this is going to be a two-part video. I'll have to do all the testing and all that in part 2. I'll do some TIG welding with it, I'll do some stick welding with it, and I'll actually measure the output of the welder so that I can see if we are actually getting the amount of output that it says that we should be getting out of it. And I'll check the duty cycle as well. I'm not going to intentionally exceed the duty cycle. I'm not going to try to make it go into thermal overload. I'm not going to try and cause an issue. I'm just going to see if we can get to the rated duty cycle without it going into thermal overload. And just overall see how it does. So that'll be in part 2, so watch for that. So I guess that's going to do it for part 1. If you think I missed anything, or if you have any questions, post it up down below. As always, thank you for watching. Take care.